The old woman could not stop staring at my daughter's neck. That is what I noticed first, in the checkout line, before she ever spoke. An elderly woman, 2 carts back, staring at the back of my grown daughter's neck with an expression I could not read, something between hope and grief and fear. And I remember thinking, in the ordinary way you think about strangers, that she must be confused or lonely, or that my daughter reminded her of someone. I had no idea that she did remind her of someone. I had no idea that the next 60 seconds would take the floor out of the life I had lived for 30 years. I did not know it yet, but I was about to lose the simplest and truest thing I believed about my own life. My name is Bernadette. I am 56 years old. I live in Yakima, Washington. And I have one daughter, Emily, whom I raised from infancy and love more than my own life. And until 8 months ago, I never once doubted, never had a single reason to doubt that she was mine. I want to tell you this story carefully because it is the kind of story people want to simplify into something it is not, and because the truth of it is more tangled and more sorrowful than a simple crime, and I owe it to everyone in it, including my late husband, to tell it as honestly as I can. I'm going to tell it in order, slowly, and let you sit with it the way I have had to. I have thought a great deal since about how a person can not know something for 30 years, and I have decided it is not the same as not knowing. There is a knowing you keep in a locked room and never visit. I built that room the month Emily came to us, and I furnished it with every unasked question, the girl I never met, the papers I never read, the man of Ronald's I never questioned, and I locked the door, and I raised my daughter in the bright rooms of the house, and I simply never went down that hall. You can live your whole life that way. Most of us are, I suspect, keeping at least one locked room. Mine happened to have my daughter's entire origin in it, and it stayed locked for 30 years, until a stranger in a grocery store put her hand on the knob. That day in the grocery store, the old woman finally worked up her nerve, or lost her grip on her manners. I have never been sure which, and she came up to us as we were loading the belt, and she touched my daughter's arm, and she said, "I'm so sorry. I know this is strange, but that birthmark on your neck," and my daughter, Emily, reached up and touched the little mark below her ear. The pale reddish patch shaped a bit like a teardrop that had been there her whole life, and the old woman's eyes filled with tears, and she said, "My granddaughter had one just like it. In just that place. We used to call it her angel's kiss." And then she seemed to catch herself, to hear how strange she sounded, and she apologized, flustered, and said something about how it must be a common thing, and she hurried out of the store without her groceries. Emily and I laughed about it a little in the car, the poor, confused old woman, and I put it out of my mind. Or I tried to. I have replayed those 60 seconds in the checkout line 10,000 times. The way the old woman's hand shook when she touched Emily's arm. The way she said angel's kiss, so tenderly, a private family word. The kind of word you only have for a child you loved. At the time, I heard it as the sad confusion of a lonely old woman. I know now that I was hearing a grandmother recognize, across 30 years and 2,000 miles, the baby she had grieved since before Emily could walk. She knew. In that instant, she knew, and she tried to be polite about the most important recognition of her life, and she fled the store rather than make a scene, and she left her groceries on the belt, and I have thought since that leaving a full cart of groceries is the truest measure of how certain she already was. But it would not leave me. That night, I lay awake, and it was not the old woman I kept thinking about. It was the birthmark itself, and a thing about it I had never let myself think about in 30 years. Because Emily's birthmark had always been a small puzzle in our family. In a way I had smoothed over so many times, I had stopped noticing I was smoothing it. Neither I nor my late husband Ronald had any such mark, nor did anyone in either of our families that we knew of. When Emily was small and people asked, "Where does she get that?" I always said, "Oh, these things come from somewhere back down the line," and changed the subject. I had changed the subject about Emily's birthmark for 30 years, without ever once asking myself why I felt the need to. I want to describe that first sleepless night honestly, because it is where the whole thing turned, and it did not turn on evidence. It turned on a feeling I had spent 3 decades refusing. Lying there in the dark, I did the thing I had never once let myself do, which was to actually count. Emily was 30. The old woman's granddaughter, taken as an infant, would be 30. Emily's birthmark had no source in either of our families. The old woman had described that exact mark in that exact place. And Emily had come to us through a channel I had, if I was truthful, never understood and never examined. None of it was proof. All of it was a shape, and the shape had been sitting in my house for 30 years, with a sheet thrown over it. And that night, for the first time, I lifted a corner of the sheet. I did not sleep because you cannot unsee a shape once you have seen it, and I lay there until dawn, knowing that I was going to have to look under the whole thing, and that looking might cost me everything. I need to tell you how Emily came to us, because it is the soil all of this grew in. Ronald and I could not have children. We had tried for years, through every heartbreak that word contains, and we had finally, in our late 20s, made our peace with a childless life. And then Ronald came home one evening, when I was 26, and told me that a private adoption had come available through a connection of his, a young mother out of state who could not keep her baby, that it had to be handled quietly and quickly and somewhat expensively, and that if we wanted her, we could have a daughter within the month. I did not ask enough questions. God forgive me, I did not ask a single hard question, because I wanted a baby so badly that when Ronald put that infant in my arms 3 weeks later, all I could see was that at long last I was a mother. The paperwork was thin. Ronald handled all of it. I did not read it closely. I was holding my daughter. Ronald was 14 years older than me, a fact that mattered more than I understood at the time. He was established when we married, a man with a settled life and settled connections, some of which I never fully mapped. He did commercial real estate, which meant he knew a great many people in a great many places, lawyers and money men and fixers, the kind of network that can, I have come to understand, make almost anything happen quietly if a man is willing to pay and not ask. I married into that network without ever really seeing into it. When he said a private adoption had come available through a connection, I pictured something warm, a friend of a friend helping a girl in trouble. I did not picture what the word connection could actually mean in a world like Ronald's. I did not want to. His competence had always been the thing that made me feel safe. It did not occur to me that the same competence that fixed our leaking roof and our tax problems could also, if he chose, fix the acquisition of a child. I have to tell you what those years of trying were like, because they are the reason I asked no questions, and I will not have anyone think I was merely careless. We lost 3 pregnancies. I sat in more doctors' offices than I can count and heard more gentle sorry. There is nothing more sentences than a person should have to hear. By 26, I had built a wall around the wanting, because the wanting was killing me, and I had told myself and Ronald that we would be all right, just the two of us, and I had almost believed it. So when Ronald stood in our kitchen and told me there was a baby, that we could actually have a baby, the wall did not come down slowly. It exploded. 30 years of grief and longing all rushed through the hole at once, and in that flood there was no room, none, for a single practical question. I have forgiven myself for that, mostly. A woman who has wanted a child that badly for that long does not interrogate the miracle, she just holds it. And Ronald knew that. I have had to sit with that too. Whatever he did or arranged or paid for, he brought the baby to the one person on earth guaranteed not to ask how, because he had watched me grieve for years, and he knew exactly how much I wanted it and exactly how little I would question it. I do not think that was cynical of him. I think, in his way, it was the opposite, that he could not stand my grief and found a way to end it, and told himself whatever he needed to tell himself about where the baby came from. But it means that my desperation was, in a sense, part of the machinery. I was the perfect mother for a stolen child precisely because I would never look. He counted on my longing the way another kind of man counts on a lock. For 30 years, that was simply the story of how we became a family. Ronald knew a man who knew a girl in trouble, and out of that trouble came the greatest joy of my life. I never questioned it, because it never occurred to me that there was anything to question. Ronald was a good husband and a good father, if a private man, a man with corners of his life he kept to himself, his work, his finances, some old friendships I never fully understood. He died 6 years ago, of a stroke, quickly, and I grieved him as a good man, and I never once, in grieving him, imagined that he had carried a secret that could unmake our whole family. But lying awake after the grocery store, with the birthmark turning over and over in my mind, I felt the first cold breath of a question I had kept a lid on for 3 decades, and once I felt it, I could not put the lid back. The one thing that ever nagged me, in all those years, was how little Ronald would say about it. Most adoptive parents I knew had a whole warm narrative: the agency, the wait, the call, the birth mother they thought of on the child's birthday. Ronald had none of that. When Emily was old enough to ask about her birth mother, Ronald would go quiet and a little hard, and say only that she had been a young woman who could not keep a baby and had done a brave thing, and that we should be grateful and not pry into a stranger's pain. It sounded like decency. It sounded like protecting a vulnerable young mother's privacy. I realize now it was the opposite. There was no young mother to protect. There was a family 2,000 miles away being told nothing, and a wall Ronald had built around a hole. And he kept us all from prying at that wall by dressing it up as respect for a person who never existed. The next morning, I did something I am still not sure was wise. I drove back to that grocery store, at the same time of day, hoping the old woman might be a regular. And I am not a bold person, but something drove me, and on the third morning she was there. I approached her, my heart going like a hammer, and I said, "You spoke to my daughter about her birthmark, and I need you to tell me about your granddaughter." And the old woman looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Come and sit with me," and we sat in her car in that parking lot. Two strangers, and she told me a story that has not let me sleep properly since. I have wondered since what gave me the nerve, a timid woman who had spent 30 years not asking, to suddenly drive back to a store to hunt down a stranger and demand the worst news of her life. And I think the answer is that some part of me had been waiting 30 years for permission to open the locked room, and the old woman's face in the checkout line was the permission. Once someone else had seen the shape too. Once it was not only my private, unspeakable suspicion, but a thing that existed in another person's eyes. I could no longer unknow it, and a strange calm replaced the timidity, the calm of a person who has finally stopped pretending. I was terrified every mile of that drive, but I was more terrified of going back to not knowing, because I understood, somewhere, that the not knowing had never really protected me. It had only postponed this exact morning. Her name was Frances, and 30 years earlier, her daughter's baby, her granddaughter, had been taken. Not lost, not given up. Taken. The baby, 6 weeks old, had been in the care of a sitter one afternoon while her exhausted young mother slept, and she had simply vanished. And the sitter's story never held together, and the police worked it hard, but the trail went cold, and the family had spent 30 years not knowing whether the child was alive or dead. And the baby, Frances told me, had a birthmark below her left ear, a pale reddish teardrop, an angel's kiss. And when Frances had seen that exact mark in that exact place on the neck of a woman of exactly the right age, in a grocery store 2,000 miles from where the baby was taken, something in her had simply broken open, and she had not been able to stop herself from speaking. I sat in that car, and I felt the blood leave my face, because 30 years earlier was when Emily came to us, and Emily was exactly the right age, and Emily had that exact mark, and my husband had brought her to me through a quiet, thin-papered, expensive arrangement that I had been too desperate to question. Frances told me about the day it happened in a flat, worn voice, the voice of a person who has told a story so many times over 30 years that it has gone smooth. Like my husband's note went smooth. Like all our worst things go smooth from handling. The sitter had been new, a friend of a friend, hired cheap. The young mother, Frances's daughter, had been up all night with the colicky baby and had finally slept. And when she woke, the sitter and the baby were both gone, and the sitter was never really found. Not the real person behind the borrowed name, and the car no one got the plate of was never traced. It had the marks, Francis said, though no one used these words at the time, of something arranged, something with money behind it, a baby taken to order rather than snatched at random. I sat in that car, and every word she said was a nail, because a baby taken to order, with money behind it, is exactly what a quiet, expensive, out-of-state arrangement would look like from the other end. I want to be honest about the days that followed, because they were the worst of my life, worse in some ways than losing Ronald, because I did not want it to be true. Everything in me fought it. I told myself birthmarks are common, that Frances was a grieving old woman seeing what she needed to see, that the coincidence was just a coincidence, that my Emily was my Emily. And underneath all of that fighting was a colder voice that had been waiting 30 years to be heard, and it was listing things. The thin paperwork, Ronald handling all of it, keeping me away from it. The out-of-state girl I never met, never spoke to, whose name I realized I had never actually known. The expense, the quiet, the speed, Ronald's private corners, and the fact that when I tried, that week, to find the adoption records to prove Frances wrong once and for all, I could not find them, because the paperwork I did locate in Ronald's old files was, when I finally read it with adult eyes, 30 years too late, not real. It did not correspond to any agency. It was a set of documents designed to look like documents. My daughter's adoption had never legally happened, because there had been no adoption. There is a specific torture in hoping to be wrong. Usually we investigate because we want to know. I investigated because I desperately wanted to disprove, to find the innocent adoption paper that would let me drive to Frances and say, gently, I am so sorry, but you are mistaken. Here is where my daughter really came from. Every step I took, hoping to build that wall instead, knocked another stone out of it. I called the agency named on the papers, and it had never existed. I looked for the lawyer whose name was signed, and there was no such lawyer, had never been, not in that state or any other. I was trying to prove my family real, and instead, I was, with my own hands, one phone call at a time, proving it built on a theft. I have never done anything harder than keep dialing, knowing that each call was more likely to take my daughter from me than to save her. I did the DNA test in the end. I had to. I could not live in the not knowing, and neither, I decided, could Frances, who had lived in it for 30 years. I told Emily as much of the truth as I could bear to, which was very hard, because Emily is not a child, she is a grown woman with a family of her own, and I was telling her that everything she knew about where she came from might be a lie, and that the woman telling her, me, might not be her mother at all. And we did the test, Emily and Frances, quietly, and we waited. And I have never prayed so hard for anything as I prayed, in that waiting, for it to come back negative, for Emily to be nobody's stolen child, for my family to be exactly what I had always believed it was. The test came back a match. Frances is Emily's grandmother. Emily is the baby who was taken 30 years ago. And my husband, my good and private husband, the man who put that infant in my arms and made me a mother, had almost certainly arranged, or paid for, the taking. There was no other way to the bottom of it, and I had finally decided I would rather stand at the bottom than keep floating on a lie. Waiting on the results of that test was the longest 10 days of my life. I did not sleep. I bargained with God in ways I am not proud of. I found myself, more than once, hoping that Frances would turn out to be some kind of gentle fraud, that there would be an innocent explanation, that a genetic test could somehow come back and hand me my old life whole. And underneath the bargaining, I already knew, the way I had already known for 30 years in the locked room, and the 10 days of waiting were really just my heart trying to catch up to what my gut had understood in a grocery store parking lot. When the results came, I read the word match, and I did not cry. Not at first. I just sat very still and felt 30 years quietly rearrange themselves into their true shape. Every birthday, every school picture, every time someone had said she doesn't look a thing like you, and I had laughed it off. All of it, True at last, and unbearable. I will never know exactly what Ronald did, or knew, or paid, because he is 6 years dead and took the truth with him. I do not know if he stole her himself, which I cannot make myself believe, or whether he paid a man who paid a sitter, whether he knew the baby was stolen or let himself not know, whether the story about the girl in trouble was a lie he told me or a lie someone told him. I have spent months trying to assemble it, and there is not enough left to assemble. What I know is the shape of it. My husband brought me a baby through a channel that turned out to be an abduction, and either engineered it or asked no questions he did not want the answers to, because he loved me and I wanted a child, and here, at last, was a way. I think, God help me, that he did it out of love. That is the part I cannot hold and cannot put down. The worst thing anyone ever did to Francis's family, my Ronald may have done out of tenderness for me, and I have had to make room, alongside my anger, for a terrible tenderness toward him that I cannot fully justify, because I keep coming back to the fact that Ronald, whatever else he was, spent 30 years being a genuinely devoted father to Emily. He read to her every night. He walked her down the aisle with tears on his face. He loved that girl with his whole heart, and if my theory of him is right, he loved her knowing, or half knowing, that she had been taken from another family who was, at that very moment, searching. How does a man hold that? How do you adore a child every day for 30 years while carrying the knowledge of what her presence cost strangers you will never meet? I do not know. Maybe he told himself the fixer's lie, that she had truly been unwanted, that he had rescued rather than stolen. Maybe he simply walled it off the way I walled off my own smaller questions. All I know is that the same man did the loving and the crime, and I lived beside him for 30 years and saw only the loving. I have tried, for my own sake and for Francis's, to reconstruct what I can, and I have hired people better at it than I am, and the picture that comes back is partial and terrible, and will probably never be complete. There was money moved 30 years ago that I can now see in old records I never understood, sums that left Ronald's accounts around the time Emily came to us with no explanation I can find. There was a man, a name that surfaces twice in his old papers and then vanishes, the kind of name that belongs to a fixer. There is no line I can draw that says here is exactly what my husband knew. But there is a fog I can point to, a fog of money and silence, and a vanishing name. And out of that fog, 30 years ago, came a 6-week-old baby with an angel's kiss below her ear, and I took her in my arms and asked nothing. And that is the part I have to live with, that my not asking was the last door the baby passed through on her way from a stolen crib to my nursery. Here is where the story refuses to resolve, and where I have to be honest that there is no clean ending. Emily has lived her entire life, 30 years of it, as my daughter, and now she is also, at the same time, Francis's stolen granddaughter, and she is standing in the impossible place between those two truths, and there is no version of the future that does not break someone's heart. Her birth mother, Francis's daughter, is alive, and has spent 30 years grieving a baby, and now has a grown daughter she never got to raise, a stranger with her eyes. And I am the woman who raised that daughter, who did the night feedings and the school plays and the wedding, who is her mother in every way except the one that a DNA test cares about, and who is also, unbearably, married to the memory of the man who caused the whole tragedy. Every person in this is both a victim and, through no choice of my own, standing near the place where another person's 30 years of grief points its finger. Emily has not turned away from me. I want to say that because it is the one mercy in all of this. She has said, more than once in tears, that I am her mother, that 30 years cannot be undone by a test, that whatever Ronald did, I did not do it, that I raised her in love and did not know. And I believe she means it. But I also see her now working to build a bond with Francis and with the birth mother she was taken from, and they are owed that. They are owed everything, and every time I watch it, I feel a grief I have no right to feel. The grief of a mother who is losing something even though she is losing it to justice, even though the people gaining it are the true victims. I have no right to my grief, and I cannot stop feeling it. And that, I have learned, is one of the loneliest positions a human being can occupy. It is a strange grief, watching your daughter gain a family. Frances is a good woman, and Emily's birth mother, whose name is Karen, is a good woman too. And they have every right in the world to Emily, more right than I have, if right is measured the way the law measures it. And I have sat in rooms with all of them now. These people who are my daughter's blood and were strangers to me a year ago. And I have watched Emily learn Karen's laugh is like her own, watched Frances weep over a grown woman she last held as a baby, and it is beautiful. It is justice. It is a wound 30 years old beginning at last to close. And I sit at the edge of it, and I am so happy for them, and so hollow at the same time, that I do not have a word for the feeling. I helped raise the answer to their 30-year prayer. And the answer to their prayer is the daughter I am, in some quiet, unavoidable way, beginning to share, and sharing her is right, and it is still a kind of dying. There is a question underneath all of this that no one has asked me out loud, and I will ask it for them, because I have asked it of myself 1,000 times. Did I really not know for 30 years? And the honest answer is the one I have already given you, that there is a difference between not knowing and refusing to know, and that I lived in that difference the way people do. I did not know a crime had been committed. I did know, somewhere I would not visit, that the story I had been given was too thin, too quiet, too unquestioned, that a normal adoption does not come with a husband who handles all the papers and a birth mother no one ever meets, and a subject that goes hard in his face when a child asks. I knew the shape was wrong, and I chose the child over the shape, every day, for 30 years. I would, I think, make the same choice again, because the child was Emily, and I cannot regret a single day of being her mother. But I will not stand here and tell you I was purely innocent. I was innocent of the crime, and guilty of the not looking, and those are not the same thing, and I have stopped pretending they are. The night I told Emily the results, we sat on my kitchen floor, both of us, two grown women on the linoleum with our backs against the cabinets, the way she and I used to sit when she was small and upset, and we did not really talk for a long time. And then she said the thing I will hold to the end of my life. She said, "Mom, you are not less my mother because of a test. You are more because you are choosing to tell me the truth, even though it costs you everything. And a stranger did the stealing, but you are the one doing the giving back." I did not deserve that grace from her. I had, however unknowingly, been raised up by a crime against her real family, but she gave it to me anyway, there on the floor, and it is the only reason I have been able to walk through the months since without dissolving entirely. I do not know how it ends, because it has not ended, and I am not sure these things ever really end. There may be legal reckonings, though Ronald is beyond them, and I do not know how much of the arrangement can even be reconstructed. There is the slow, painful work of everyone learning to hold what is true, that Emily belongs, impossibly, to two families now, one that grew her in secret theft, and one that lost her to it, and that love and crime built the same daughter. What I have surrendered is the simple version of my own life. For 30 years, I believed I was a lucky woman, whom fortune had finally blessed with a child. I was, instead, the innocent beneficiary of the worst thing that ever happened to another family, and I never knew. And my not knowing does not give them their 30 years back. So I do not have a lesson for you, not the kind these stories usually end with. I only have this. If there is a thing in your family story that everyone smooths over, a small unanswered question that you have all agreed, without ever saying so, not to ask, a birthmark that comes from nowhere, papers no one ever quite produces, a beloved's private corner you have chosen for decades not to look into. I am not telling you it hides a horror like mine. Most of them do not. But I spent 30 years actively not asking about my daughter's birthmark, and the not asking did not make the truth less true. It only meant that when the truth finally came, in a grocery store, from a grieving stranger, it came all at once, 30 years late, and took out the floor of everyone's life in a single afternoon. The questions we are most afraid to ask are usually the ones we already, somewhere underneath, know the answer to. Ask them while there is still someone alive who can answer.